Marshal Dorvin Kesrath stood on the command deck of the Iron Verdict and looked at the dim red star on the main display, the way a hungry man looks at a meal that has not yet been served to him. The star had a name in the human catalogs, something short and forgettable. In the records of the Thessar hegemony, it was simply border marker 19, a pin in a long chain of pins that separated hegemony space from the territory claimed by a species that, 40 years ago, had folded after a single hard push. He had read every report on that old engagement. The Battle of the Cold Drift, the humans called it, when they bothered to call it anything at all. 3 hegemony cruisers had met a scattered human convoy escorted by a handful of outdated frigates. The humans had fired wildly, lost 2 ships, and retreated into the dark without firing another shot for the rest of the war. It had been, by hegemony standards, barely worth a footnote. Kesrath had built his entire campaign plan on that footnote. Marshal. The voice belonged to Sale Murren, his intelligence liaison, a thin woman with pale gray eyes who had spent the better part of a decade studying human signal traffic before anyone in Fleet Command thought it worth the budget. She stood at the edge of the holodable with a data slate held against her chest like a shield. I would like another moment of your time before the squadron crosses the marker. You have had 4 moments already this week, liaison. Kesrath did not turn from the display, each one longer than the last, because each one has been more urgent than the last. Murren set the slate on the table, and the projection above it bloomed into a tangle of intercepted human chatter, translated and annotated in tight hegemony script. This is traffic from the human border garrison at what they call Calder's Reach, recorded 11 days ago. It does not match the doctrine in our files. Kesrath glanced at it the way a man glances at rain he has already decided not to walk through. Doctrine does not change because a garrison commander has a new vocabulary. It is not vocabulary, Marshal. It is structure. Murren's finger traced a branching pattern across the projection, dozens of independent threads of communication that never converged on a single point of authority. There is no central voice giving orders here. Every vessel commander is making operational decisions and broadcasting only their intent, not requests for permission. We have intercepted nothing like a chain of command in any of these transmissions. Then their chain of command is simply quiet, Kesrath said. Disciplined commanders do not chatter on open channels. They are not chattering, Marshal. They are coordinating, without anyone telling them to. Murren hesitated, and Kesrath finally turned to look at her, because hesitation from Murren was rarer than a comet. I have studied this species since before you took command of this fleet. What we fought 40 years ago is not what exists now. They call this the lattice. Every captain trained to think and act as though they alone were the entire fleet, bound together not by orders but by shared purpose. It produces something our doctrine has no model for. A model for chaos, Kesrath said, is not a model worth fearing. I did not say it was chaos. I said it was unfamiliar. Those are not the same thing. Murren's voice did not rise, but something in it sharpened. Marshal, the border treaty grants the humans a transit corridor through this system for their mining convoys. We have no legal claim to interfere with the station at the edge of it. If you move on Wellspring, you are not testing an old enemy. You are provoking one we do not understand. Kesrath let the silence sit for a moment, long enough that 2 junior officers near the helm found reasons to look very intently at their own consoles. Then he said, in the patient tone he used for subordinates he had already decided to ignore, Liaison Murren, I did not request a legal opinion. I requested an intelligence briefing. There is a difference, and I would ask you to remember it. I remember it very well, sir, Murren said. I am giving you both because only one of them is going to keep this fleet alive. It was, Kesrath thought, almost admirable, the way she kept pushing against a wall that had clearly already won. He remembered briefly the way his own mentor had once described intelligence officers to him, decades ago, back when Kesrath himself had been a junior lieutenant standing exactly where Murren now stood. They are the conscience of a fleet, his mentor had said, and a wise commander listens to his conscience even when he has no intention of obeying it. Kesrath had always thought that a strange thing to say, a contradiction dressed up as wisdom. Now, watching Murren gather her slate with the careful, controlled patience of someone who had said everything she could think to say and still expected to be ignored, He understood it a little better than he wanted to. He had not always been so certain of himself. 22 years ago, as a junior squadron commander assigned to put down an uprising on the mining moon of Cores Tertius, he had pushed for a cautious, gradual approach, and had been overruled by a marshal far more senior than himself who wanted a fast, decisive show of force instead. The fast approach had worked. It had cost more lives than Kesrath's plan would have, but it had worked, and the marshal who overruled him had gone on to a seat on the Council of Spears, while Kesrath spent the better part of a decade learning, slowly and at considerable personal cost, that the hegemony rewarded decisive certainty far more reliably than it rewarded careful doubt. He had built his entire career since then on the lesson of that uprising, and it had served him well enough, right up until the moment he stood on the bridge of the Iron Verdict, listening to a woman half his rank tell him that everything that lesson had taught him might no longer apply. It was not a comfortable thought, and Kesrath did what he had always done with uncomfortable thoughts. He set it aside, filed it next to the dozen other doubts he had learned to carry without letting them show on his face, and focused instead on the deep space sensor array sitting in Wellspring's orbit, the prize that would, he was certain, finally earn him the seat on the council that the uprising on Cores Tertius had cost him 22 years ago. He had earned his marshal's collar through 3 decades of obedience rewarded with promotion, the hegemony way, the only way that had ever worked. A man did not rise in the Thessar military by questioning the orders of those above him, and he did not expect his subordinates to rise by questioning his. The unbroken chain was not a slogan stitched onto recruitment posters. It was the entire architecture of hegemony power, an unbroken line of command running from the Council of Spears all the way down to the newest deckhand, every link trusting the one above it absolutely, because the alternative was the kind of disorder that had torn apart 3 hegemony client states in the last century alone. Humans, by his understanding, had no such architecture, which meant, to Kesrath's mind, that they had no real military at all. A swarm of independent actors was not an army. It was a crowd with weapons, and crowds broke the moment something pushed back hard enough. "I have made my decision," he said. "Wellspring Station sits on a deep space sensor array that watches 3 systems of hegemony space without our consent. The Corridor Treaty does not grant them the right to spy on us under the cover of a mining license. We will move on the station, demand the array's data logs and its decommissioning, and use the resulting concession to bring the entire border negotiation back to a footing that favors the hegemony. If the humans wish to escalate over a mining outpost and some old sensor equipment, they will find that the Iron Verdict and 4 cruisers are not a force they can match, old doctrine or new." Murren did not argue further. She had learned over the years exactly how much further arguing would accomplish, which was nothing at all once Kesrath had said the words, "I have made my decision." She gathered her slate, inclined her head with the correct degree of formal respect, and said only, "Understood, Marshal. I will keep monitoring their traffic. If something changes, you will hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else." "See that I do," Kesrath said, already turning back to the star. 6 light-years away, on a station called Wellspring that orbited a tired orange dwarf nobody back on Earth could place on a map without help. The morning shift was running 20 minutes behind, because the recycler in Habitat Ring 2 had jammed again, and Owen Reyes had personally crawled into the access duct to fix it himself rather than wait for the maintenance queue. "You're the colony director," said his second-in-command, a broad-shouldered man named Philip Yako, watching Reyes back out of the duct covered in grease. "You have an entire staff for this." "My entire staff is 6 people and 4 of them are asleep," Reyes said, wiping his hands on a rag that had clearly given up trying to be clean weeks ago. "Besides, I like knowing how the station actually works. Makes it harder for anyone to tell me it's broken when it isn't." Wellspring was not a large place. 1,100 people, give or take, most of them tied to the mining operation that pulled rare isotopes out of the asteroid belt 2 days out, the rest running the small research wing that studied the dwarf star's unusually active flare cycle. It was the kind of posting that did not show up in recruitment brochures, too far from the nearest real city, too quiet for anyone chasing excitement. The people who came to Wellspring came because they wanted the kind of quiet that did not exist anywhere closer to home, and most of them stayed far longer than their original contracts. Ray's had been there 11 years. His daughter, Iris, had grown up on the station before leaving for the Fleet Academy, and she still came back on every leave rotation she could manage, usually flying the supply runs herself when the schedule allowed it, because nobody trusted the final approach into Wellspring's tight docking corridor more than she did. She was due in that afternoon, in fact, piloting the light frigate Halsey's Promise on a routine border patrol loop that happened to swing past her father's station twice a season. Ray's had already told the kitchen staff to put aside 2 portions of the good stew, the kind made from real vegetables grown in the hydro bay rather than the reconstituted stuff that made up most of the station's diet, because Iris complained about the reconstituted stuff every single time, and he found he never got tired of hearing it. Down in the hydro bay itself, a retired sergeant named Walt Brennan was running the station's small civilian militia through their twice-monthly drill, the same drill he had run for the better part of 6 years, since washing out of active service with a bad knee and a stubborn refusal to stop being useful. 20-some volunteers, miners and lab technicians, and one of the station's 2 school teachers, moved through basic defensive positions among rows of tomato plants and recycled hydroponic troughs, none of them under any illusion that hunting rifles and improvised armor would hold off a real military force, but all of them quietly proud of the fact that Wellspring did not simply sit and hope nothing bad ever happened to it. Lattice doctrine isn't just for fleet captains, Brennan liked to tell the new volunteers, every cycle, in the same gruff tone he probably thought sounded less sentimental than it actually did. Every one of you matters just as much as any admiral out there if the day ever comes you need to matter. Nobody's going to radio you permission to protect your own home. You already have it. Just remember how to use it. It was the kind of thing people on Wellspring had heard often enough to stop really hearing it. The background noise of a station that had built an entire culture, almost without realizing it, around the simple idea that everyone on it was trusted to act rather than wait. Ray's had encouraged it from his first year as director, not because he expected an attack, but because he had always believed a community that trusted its own people held together better than one that waited for instructions from somewhere far away. He had no way of knowing, that particular morning, just how soon that belief would be tested. Director. The voice over the comm belonged to Lena Ackafer, who ran the station's small sensor and traffic control office. We've got an unscheduled contact at the edge of the corridor. 5 ships, reading as hegemony military configuration. They're not on any approved transit list. Ray's set down the rag. Wellspring's defenses consisted of a handful of point defense turrets meant for debris, a civilian militia drilled twice a month by a retired sergeant who ran the hydroponics bay the rest of the time, and whatever protection the Halsey's Promise could offer if she happened to be in the system, which today, by sheer coincidence, she was. Hail them, he said. Standard corridor protocol. Ask their business. Already did. No response yet. A pause longer than Ray's liked. Director, they're not slowing down. Iris Ray's felt the Halsey's Promise shudder under her hands, a full 11 seconds before the proximity alarm caught up to what her instincts already knew, which was that something was very wrong with the 5 contacts dropping out of transit on the edge of Wellspring's system. Talk to me, she said to her sensor officer, a young man named David Prout who had been with her for exactly 4 months, and had not yet seen anything that justified the amount of training he'd received for moments like this one. 5 capital signatures, hegemony configuration, one of them reading as a heavy command cruiser. Prout's voice cracked slightly on the word command. They're broadcasting a demand, ma'am. Surrender of the station's deep array and full inspection rights or they open fire in 10 minutes. Iris had grown up on Wellspring. She knew its corridors, its recycler problems, the particular smell of the hydro bay in the mornings, and the sound her father's boots made on the deck plating when he was annoyed about something. She also knew, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent her entire adult life training for exactly this kind of moment, that 1 frigate against 5 hegemony warships was not a fight. It was a delay tactic, and the only question worth asking was how much time that delay could buy. "Get me a tight beam to Fleet Relay," she said. "Tell them what we're looking at, full sensor dump, and tell them we need anyone in range to converge. Don't wait for a response, just send it and keep sending it." "Ma'am, shouldn't we wait for orders from Sector Command before we engage?" "We're not engaging to win, David. We're engaging to be seen engaging, so the next ship that arrives knows exactly what it's walking into." She brought the Halcyon's Promise around, putting the frigate between the incoming cruisers and the station's main docking ring, close enough that anyone watching her sensor profile would have no doubt at all about her intentions. And no, we're not waiting for orders. By the time Sector Command answers, this will already be over one way or the other. Send the distress call on the lattice channel, full priority, and let every captain who hears it decide for themselves what they're going to do about it. It was, in the strictest sense, against the letter of standard procedure. It was also exactly what 11 years of lattice doctrine training had prepared her to do without a second thought, and she did not hesitate over it for even a heartbeat. The hegemony cruisers did not wait for the 10 minutes to run out. Marshal Kesrath had given the order from the bridge of the Iron verdict the moment his sensors confirmed. There was only a single light frigate standing between his squadron and the station, a target so far beneath the threat threshold of his force that he considered the brief skirmish more a formality than a battle. He wanted the demonstration clean, fast, a single overwhelming show of force that would make the eventual negotiation a foregone conclusion. He did not want a drawn-out fight that gave the humans time to rally something larger. "Concentrate fire on the frigate," he ordered. "Disable, do not destroy if it can be helped. A captured human vessel will make a useful exhibit during negotiations." The Halcyon's Promise fought harder than 5 centuries of hegemony combat doctrine said a single light frigate should have been able to fight. Iris put the ship through maneuvers that made her point defense gunners earn every kill they scored, stripped 2 of the incoming cruiser's shield generators down to embarrassing levels before her own shields finally buckled, and held the line for 19 minutes against odds that any reasonable tactical computer would have called suicidal from the start. It was not enough to win. It was never going to be enough to win. But it bought Wellspring 19 minutes it would not otherwise have had, and it put a clean, undeniable record of hegemony aggression onto every relay between the border and the nearest human fleet depot. On the station itself, Owen Reyes stood in the main control room with his hand on the comm panel and refused, 3 separate times, to authorize the surrender of the Deep Array's data logs. It was, he understood clearly, a decision that put every soul on Wellspring at greater risk than a quiet capitulation would have. He made it anyway, because handing over years of sensor data that mapped hegemony fleet movements through 3 systems felt, to him, like a betrayal of every ship that data had ever helped protect, and because some part of him still believed that the Halcyon's Promise outside the window, and whatever else might be coming behind her, made the gamble worth taking. The boarding parties that eventually breached Wellspring's outer ring met no organized resistance worth the name, just a station's worth of frightened civilians, and a handful of militia volunteers who fought with hunting rifles against hegemony combat armor for exactly as long as it took to understand the fight was already lost. Reyes was struck once across the side of the head by a hegemony soldier impatient with his continued refusals, and went down hard against the edge of his own control console. He did not get back up before the rest of the station's command staff were rounded up, and the Deep Array was forcibly cut from the network. Iris did not learn any of this until well after the Halcyon's Promise, her hull venting atmosphere from 3 separate breaches, limped out of weapons range under the cover of a final desperate burn that her engineer swore afterward should not have been physically possible given the state of the drive coils. She had lost the fight. She had not lost the war, not yet, and as she set a heading for the nearest fleet relay point with half her crew wounded and her sensor officer quietly throwing up in the corner from the G-forces of that last burn, she sent one more message ahead of her on every channel she had left. Wellspring Station has been seized by hegemony forces. Civilian casualties confirmed. Director Owen Reyes status unknown. Requesting immediate fleet response. This is not a drill. Admiral Naomi Cal received the report in her office at Joint Fleet Command on Earth, seated at a desk that had belonged to 3 admirals before her, in a building old enough that its foundations had survived 2 wars that predated the hegemony's existence as far as human records were concerned. She read the report twice, all the way through, before she said anything at all. "Confirm the source," she said finally. "Confirmed, Admiral." Lattice authentication on the transmission checks out. It's genuinely from the Halsey's Promise, Lieutenant Commander Iris Reyes commanding. Her aide, a sharp young commander named Defoe, hesitated before adding, "Admiral, that's Owen Reyes' daughter, Wellspring's director." "I know whose daughter she is, Commander." Cal's voice did not change, though something behind her eyes did briefly, before settling back into the same level calm she had carried through every crisis briefing of her career. She had known Owen Reyes personally, years ago, before he'd taken the Wellspring posting, back when they'd both been junior officers learning the same hard lessons about what it cost to hold a line. Pull every available hull within 4 days' transit of the border corridor. I want the Lattice protocol activated for Sector 19 effective immediately. Full activation, Admiral. That's every independent command authority in the sector. Some of those captains haven't seen a live engagement in years. That's the point of the Lattice, Commander. I don't need to tell 200 captains what to do. I need to tell them what happened and trust them to do what they were trained to do. Cal stood, smoothing the front of her uniform with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned long ago that panic solved nothing a clear head couldn't solve faster. Send the full report, unedited, to every command authority in range. Let them see exactly what was done to that station and exactly what was done to that frigate. I'm not going to dress this up or soften it. They deserve to know precisely what they're responding to. And the response itself, should I draft rules of engagement? No, Cal said. Send the facts. The response is theirs to decide. That's how this is supposed to work. She paused at the window for a moment, looking out at a sky that held no trace of the war now beginning 6 light years away, and added, more quietly, Owen Reyes ran that station because he believed in something simple, that people who trusted each other could do more than people who were simply ordered around. I am not about to betray that the first time it actually matters. Within the hour, the report reached 211 separate command authorities across Sector 19, from heavy cruiser squadrons 3 days out to a single aging gunship on a fuel resupply run that happened to be passing close enough to matter. No central order told any of them what formation to fly, what targets to prioritize, or when to arrive. Each captain read the same unedited account of what had happened to Wellspring Station and the Halsey's Promise, and each one made an independent decision about what to do next, bound together by nothing but a shared understanding of what was at stake and a doctrine that trusted them to act on it without waiting to be told. It did not look, from the outside, like the beginning of an organized fleet response. It looked, if anyone had been watching from the hegemony side of the border, like exactly the kind of disorganized scattering that confirmed every assumption Marshal Kesrath had already made about the species he was about to fight. Kesrath received the first sensor returns on the incoming human presence 2 days after the seizure of Wellspring, while his squadron sat in orbit over the captured station processing the deep array's data and overseeing the slow, methodical interrogation of its staff. The contact registered as small, no more than a dozen scattered hulls approaching from several different vectors, none of them larger than a light cruiser, none of them flying in anything resembling a coordinated formation. As I expected, he said to Murren, who stood beside the holodable studying the same data with an expression he had learned to read as cautious rather than relieved. A handful of frightened captains rushing forward without orders, hoping numbers alone will frighten us off. This is the disorganized rabble I described to you, Liaison, exactly as the old records predicted. They are not flying in formation because they do not need to be in formation to coordinate, Murren said, her eyes still on the scattered approach vectors. Marshal, look at the spacing. It is not random. Every one of those ships is positioned to cover a different approach to the station while still being able to support the others within minutes. No central order produced that. They worked it out independently in transit, without speaking to each other on any channel we have intercepted. Coincidence, Kesrath said, though something in the way the dots moved on the display made the word taste slightly less certain in his mouth than he would have liked. Marshal. The voice belonged to his communications officer, a young man named Terk Val, who had gone slightly pale at his console. Sensors are now picking up considerably more contacts than the initial 12. They were running passive on approach. I'm reading at least 40 additional signatures now, bringing up active drive signatures, and the number is still climbing. Kesrath looked at the display, at the dots that had seemed so small and so scattered only a moment before, now multiplying across every approach vector to Wellspring at once. And for the first time since he had crossed border marker 19, he felt the cold, unfamiliar pressure of a plan that no longer fit the situation in front of him. "Bring the squadron to full readiness," he said, and if his voice was steady, it was only because 3 decades of discipline had taught him never to let his subordinates hear anything else. "It seems the humans intend to make this more interesting than I had planned." Behind him, Murren said nothing at all, which from her was its own kind of answer. The first wave of the human counterattack did not look like an attack at all, not at first, and that was precisely the problem. Marshal Kesrath watched the scattered human contacts continue their approach across 40 separate vectors, refusing to consolidate into anything his tactical computers recognized as a formation, and ordered his squadron to hold position around Wellspring, rather than commit to chasing down targets that kept refusing to present themselves as targets. It was, he told himself, the correct call. A disciplined force did not break formation to swat at gnats. It waited for the enemy to commit, then crushed whatever shape that commitment finally took. The trouble was that the humans never committed to a shape at all. A pair of light cruisers under a captain named Renwick darted close enough to fire a single coordinated salvo at the Iron Verdict's escort screen, then peeled away before the cruiser squadron's return fire could properly track them, only for a different pair of frigates on the opposite side of the formation to do the same thing 4 minutes later. Drone swarms, cheap and disposable, harassed hegemony point defense grids from a dozen directions at once, forcing every cruiser captain to divide attention and ammunition across threats that individually meant nothing and collectively meant a slow, grinding attrition that no single engagement would show clearly until the damage reports started piling up. "Marshal, the Vow of Ash requests permission to break from the screen and pursue the frigates that struck her port flank," Val reported from communications. "Captain Drasek believes he can run them down before they reach cover." "Denied," Kesrath said. "He holds the screen. I will not have captains scattering across the field chasing every nuisance that presents itself. We commit as a fleet on my order against a target worth committing to." It was the correct doctrine. It had been the correct doctrine for 300 years of hegemony warfare, a discipline that had won them more battles than any single tactical genius ever could have, because an army that moved as one body, on one will, could not be tricked into tearing itself apart chasing phantoms. Kesrath repeated this to himself several times as he watched Captain Drasek hold the screen exactly as ordered and take 3 further hits from frigates he had been forbidden to pursue, hits that a faster, looser response might have prevented entirely. 4 systems away, a human captain named Renwick made the opposite call without asking anyone's permission at all. When her sensors flagged a hegemony supply tender attempting to slip behind the main engagement to resupply the cruiser screen, she did not radio sector command, did not wait for Admiral Cal's staff to issue a directive, and did not consult any of the other captains converging on Wellspring from a dozen different directions. She simply broke off, intercepted the tender, and disabled it with a precision strike that cost her nothing and cost the hegemony screen its resupply within the hour. By the time anyone in human command heard about the engagement at all, it was already over, logged, and folded seamlessly into the shared intelligence picture every other captain in the lattice could see and act on without being told to. "This is not a battle," Kesrath said, watching his tactical display fill with a slow, creeping red tide of damaged and disabled vessels that no single decisive engagement could explain. "It is 1,000 small wounds with no single wound large enough to justify a response. Murren, explain this to me. Now." Sale Murren had been waiting, in a sense, for this exact question since the day she had first studied the lattice transmissions out of Calder's reach, and she gave him the answer she had been building for years without a trace of satisfaction in her voice, because there was nothing satisfying about watching a prediction prove correct at this particular cost. They do not have a single brain directing this fleet, Marshal, because they do not need one. Every captain out there has been trained to understand the overall purpose, not merely their individual orders, and trusted to act on that understanding without waiting for permission. When Captain Renwick saw an opportunity to cripple your resupply line, she took it, because the doctrine trusts her judgment as much as it trusts yours or mine. There is no delay between observation and action, because there is no chain to climb and descend before a decision can be made. That is not discipline, Kesrath said. That is anarchy with good aim. It is discipline of a different kind than ours, Marshal, and I would ask you to consider that the difference is the entire reason we are losing ships faster than we can identify what is hitting us. Murren's voice held none of the satisfaction of being right, only a flat, urgent worry. Every minute Captain Drasek waited for your permission to pursue, the humans who struck him made 3 more decisions on their own. We are fighting at the speed of 1 mind. They are fighting at the speed of 100. Kesrath stared at the display for a long moment, at the accumulating damage, at the stubborn refusal of the human fleet to ever consolidate into a single target worth crushing, and felt something in his chest that he did not have a comfortable word for, because admitting it was fear would have meant admitting that 30 years of doctrine had failed him in the span of a single engagement. Then we remove the need for speed, he said finally. Find their command authority. Whoever is coordinating this, whatever ship or station is feeding them their shared picture, and we destroy it. Cut the head from this 100-minded beast and see how well it fights when it is finally forced to think with only one brain again. It was, in its own way, the most reasonable response available to him, built on the only model of command he had ever trusted. It was also, Murren understood with a sinking certainty she did not bother voicing aloud, based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what he was actually fighting, because the lattice had no head to cut off. It had no single point of failure, no command ship whose destruction would silence the rest, only thousands of individually trained minds who would simply keep making good decisions, whether or not any particular one of them survived the next 10 minutes. Iris Reyes had spent the 2 days since her escape from Wellspring in a fleet medical bay having shrapnel removed from her left shoulder, refusing every offer of extended leave, and listening with growing, controlled fury to every scrap of intelligence that filtered in about the condition of the civilians still held on her father's station. When the call came through for volunteers willing to attempt a close-quarters extraction of the hostages while the main fleet kept hegemony attention occupied elsewhere, she did not wait for anyone to ask whether she wanted in. You're not cleared for combat duty, the medical officer told her, not for the first time. That shoulder needs another 4 days minimum. My father is on that station, Iris said, already pulling her flight jacket on over the bandages. 4 days is not a number that means anything to me right now. The extraction team that assembled around her was small by design. 6 volunteers from 3 different ships who had never trained together and did not need to, because every one of them had come through the same lattice doctrine that made coordinating with strangers under fire feel less like improvisation, and more like simply doing the job the way they'd always been taught to do it. A young lieutenant named Castellano, who had served with Iris's father years earlier, volunteered without being asked twice. A pair of Marines from a cruiser 2 systems over offered themselves up the moment the call went out, on nothing but a shared read of the mission brief, and a trust that whoever was running it knew what they were doing. Hegemony security on the station is split between guarding the deep array and guarding the hostages, Castellano reported during the brief. Mission window the team had to plan before the insertion craft launched. Their numbers are thin, because most of their security force got pulled to reinforce the fleet screen after Renwick's strike on the supply tender. If we go in fast and quiet through the maintenance access on Ring 3, we can be at the hostage holding area before anyone realizes we're aboard. Then that's what we do, Iris said. No waiting for a perfect plan. We adjust once we're inside and see what's actually there. That's the job. It was not, by any reasonable accounting, a safe operation. 6 fighters against an unknown number of hegemony security personnel, on a station whose internal layout had changed, since the occupation began in ways none of them could fully predict, with no backup available beyond what the rest of the Lattice fleet could provide by keeping hegemony attention focused elsewhere. Iris led the insertion anyway, through a maintenance duct she had crawled through as a child sneaking snacks from the kitchen stores, past two startled hegemony guards her Marines dropped before either could raise an alarm, into a holding bay where 80-some terrified civilians sat under guard, including her father's deputy, Philip Yako, who looked up at her entrance with an expression somewhere between disbelief and pure relief. "Iris," Yako's voice cracked. "We thought you didn't make it out." "I made it out." "Where's my father?" The silence that answered her told her most of what she needed to know before Yako said a single word, and when he finally spoke, gently, the way a man speaks when he has had 2 days to figure out how to say something terrible without making it worse, she already understood. "He went down fighting them on the surrender of the array data," Yako said. "He didn't suffer long, Iris. I promise you that much. He never gave them what they wanted." Iris Reyes had trained for years to make decisions under pressure without letting emotion slow her down. And she did exactly that now, filing the grief away in some compartment that she would have to open eventually, but did not have the luxury of opening in the middle of a hostage extraction still very much in progress. She gave the order to move the civilians toward the extraction point in a voice that did not shake, organized the wounded into a manageable evacuation order, and led 83 people through a station her father had built a life on, out through a docking bay her Marines secured with brutal efficiency, onto a transport that broke for open space, the moment the last civilian cleared the airlock. She did not let herself cry until they were 3 minutes into the burn, alone for a moment in the transport's narrow cockpit, and even then she allowed herself exactly 90 seconds before wiping her face, checking the sensor board, and getting back to the job of flying her father's people somewhere safe. The convergence that broke Marshal Kesrath's squadron did not arrive as a single coordinated strike ordered from any one authority, which was precisely why he never saw it coming until it had already arrived. Admiral Cal, watching the shared tactical picture from Joint Fleet Command 6 light-years away, had issued no master battle plan because the Lattice did not require one. She had simply made certain every captain converging on Wellspring understood the full shape of the situation, the location of the hostages, the disposition of the hegemony screen, the vulnerability created by the loss of their supply tender, and trusted that 200 independently thinking commanders, looking at the same picture and sharing the same purpose, would arrive at compatible conclusions without needing to be told what those conclusions should be. They did. 11 separate squadrons, none of them larger than a handful of ships, none of them in direct communication with more than 2 or 3 of the others at any given moment, each reached the same tactical judgment within minutes of each other. That the hegemony screen, stretched thin chasing harassment strikes across 40 vectors, and denied the flexibility to consolidate by a command structure that required Kesrath's personal authorization for any major repositioning, had become critically vulnerable along its rear flank exactly where the supply tender had once provided cover. The strike that followed did not look, on any hegemony tactical display, like the product of careful planning. It looked like 11 different attacks happening at once from 11 different directions, uncoordinated, opportunistic, almost accidental in its precision. It was, in fact, the natural result of trusting 200 well-trained minds to recognize the same opportunity and act on it without waiting for permission that would have arrived, if it arrived at all, several critical minutes too late to matter. "Marshal, the Vow of Ash is requesting emergency repositioning. She's taking fire from 3 directions and has no clear vector to retreat to the main formation." "Marshal, the Cold Iron Spear reports the rear screen is collapsing. Multiple human squadrons converging on a position we have no reserve force to cover." "Marshal, I need an order. The formation does not hold if we do not consolidate now." Kesrath stood at the center of a hollow-table filling with red, watching a battle plan built on 300 years of doctrine come apart not because any single human decision had been brilliant, but because 100 adequate decisions, made simultaneously and without delay, had simply moved faster than his own command structure could process and respond to. He gave the order to consolidate. It reached his captains 40 seconds after he gave it, the unavoidable cost of a command authority that required every major decision to pass through a single point before it could be acted on. And 40 seconds, in a battle now measured in moments, was an eternity that several of his ships did not survive long enough to make use of. Marshal Kesrath, Terk Val's voice from the communications station, had gone thin and unsteady in a way that cut through even the chaos on the bridge. "Sir, I have a contact identification I need to confirm with you directly." "Report it, Val. I do not have patience for ceremony right now." "Sir, it's the humans." Val's hands were visibly shaking on his console. "The main convergence, the formation we couldn't get a clean read on. It's not reinforcements arriving late. It's been the same fleet all along, the same 40 ships we first detected 2 days ago, simply repositioning continuously this entire time without ever needing to regroup first. They never stopped being a single coherent force, Marshal. We just couldn't see it because they never needed to look like one to act like one." He swallowed hard before finishing. "General, it is the humans, and sir, I do not think they are amused." It was not, strictly speaking, a useful piece of tactical information. It did not tell Kesrath where to direct his remaining fire or which of his crumbling flanks most urgently needed reinforcement. But something in the flat, horrified certainty of his communications officer's voice landed on the bridge of the iron verdict with the weight of a verdict already rendered. And for the first time in his career, Marshal Dorvin Kesrath understood, with absolute clarity, that he had built his entire campaign on an enemy that did not exist anymore, against a force he had never once managed to properly see until it was already standing over the wreckage of his certainty. The iron verdict took her crippling blow from a strike group of 6 frigates that arrived from a Vector Kesrath's sensors, had marked as low priority 3 full minutes before the moment it mattered. A Vector left undefended because the captain responsible for covering it had been ordered, on Kesrath's direct authority, to reinforce a different flank that had since proven to be a feint. The cruiser's main drive went dark. Her shield generators followed less than a minute later. Around her, the remnants of his squadron, the Vow of Ash disabled and drifting, the Cold Iron Spear boarded by a Marine strike team that had simply walked through a security response too slow and too centralized to react in time, the rest scattered and individually overwhelmed by human forces that never stopped moving long enough to present a single target worth committing the dwindling hegemony reserve against. Marshal. This came from his executive officer, a steady, gray-haired man named Havoc who had served under 3 previous marshals and had learned across that span exactly when a recommendation needed to be made regardless of how unwelcome it would be received. "We have lost effective control of 4 of 5 vessels in this squadron. The Iron Verdict herself cannot maneuver and cannot generate a defensive shield. I must recommend we signal for terms before this becomes a massacre rather than a defeat." "The unbroken chain does not request terms," Kesrath said, though the words came out with less conviction than he had ever heard in his own voice before. "We hold position. We fight until relief arrives or until the engagement is decided by force, as hegemony doctrine requires. Marshal, with respect, the engagement has already been decided." Havoc's voice did not rise, did not waver, simply stated the fact the way a man states a fact he has had time to fully accept. "There is no relief coming. There is no reserve left to commit. Every additional minute we hold this position costs lives that a request for terms would not cost. I am not asking you to dishonor the chain, sir. I am asking you to recognize that the chain was built to win wars, not to waste the people inside it on a battle already lost." Kesrath looked at the display one final time, at the wreckage of a squadron he had been certain, only days earlier, would crush a feeble, disorganized rabble of independent actors who could not possibly outfight a unified, disciplined force. He thought briefly of Murren's warnings, every one of which he had dismissed, and of the cold, flat horror in Terk Val's voice reporting an identification that had told him nothing about tactics and everything about the scale of his own miscalculation. "Signal the human flagship," he said finally. "Request terms, and Havoc. Marshal, get Liaison Murren to the bridge. If anyone aboard this ship still understands what we are actually negotiating with, it is her, and I have wasted enough lives already pretending I did not need to listen to her. Admiral Naomi Cal received the hegemony request for terms from the bridge of her own flagship, the Resolute Lattice, which had spent the entire engagement 4 systems away from the actual fighting, coordinating nothing more directly than ensuring every captain in the Convergence had access to the same shared tactical picture. She had not given a single direct tactical order during the entire battle. She had not needed to. "Patch me through," she said. "And get Lieutenant Commander Reyes on this channel as well. She has earned the right to hear these terms discussed before they're finalized." The terms Cal delivered to a visibly shaken Marshal Kesrath, broadcast on a channel both fleets could verify, were neither generous nor vindictive. The hegemony would withdraw all forces beyond border marker 19 within 48 hours. Every surviving hostage, military or civilian, would be returned, with full medical support provided for the wounded regardless of which side had injured them. Wellspring Station's deep array data, seized during the occupation, would be returned intact and unread, a condition Cal insisted on not out of trust, but because she wanted the hegemony to understand precisely how little humanity had needed to violate in order to win. There would be no demand for reparative annexation of hegemony territory, no punitive strike against undefended systems, no attempt to press the advantage beyond restoring exactly what had been taken. "You could ask for more," Kesrath said, his voice carrying clearly across the open channel, edged with something that might have been confusion or might have been the first faint stirring of respect. "You have the position to demand far more than the simple return of what was stolen." "I am aware of what we could ask for, Marshal," Cal said. "We are not asking for it, because this was never about taking something from the hegemony. It was about making certain you understood that taking something from us carries a cost you will not be willing to pay twice. There is a difference between winning a war and proving a point. I only need to prove the point." It was not, Kesrath understood as he listened, a mercy born of weakness, and it was not the chaotic, undisciplined victory of a crowd that had simply gotten lucky against a superior force. It was the calm, deliberate restraint of a power that had never doubted, even in the chaos of the engagement, exactly what it was fighting for and exactly when to stop. He thought of the unbroken chain, of 3 centuries of doctrine built on the unshakable belief that obedience alone produced victory, and understood, with the particular clarity that only total defeat can provide, that he had spent his entire career mistaking the chain for the only kind of strength that mattered. Wellspring Station took 4 months to fully repair, and Iris Reyes spent every leave rotation she could manage helping with the rebuilding, because some debts were not the kind you paid off from a distance. She stood, on a quiet evening 8 months after the battle, at a small memorial garden that the station's hydroponics team had planted in the corner of Habitat Ring 2, a patch of real green growing under recycled light, with her father's name carved into a simple marker, alongside 11 others who had not survived the occupation. Philip Yako found her there, as he often did these days, and stood beside her without saying much of anything for a while, because there was a particular kind of silence between people who had survived the same terrible thing together that did not need filling. "He'd have hated all this fuss," Yako said eventually, nodding at the garden. "Always said a station ran better when people stopped worrying about monuments and just got back to fixing the recycler." "He'd have loved it," Iris said, and found, for the first time in months, that she could say it with something closer to a smile than grief. He just would have pretended otherwise and gone back to crawling into access ducts within the hour. 6 light-years away, in a hegemony war college that had spent 3 centuries teaching the unshakable doctrine of the unbroken chain without ever seriously questioning it, a new mandatory case study had quietly entered the curriculum, one that every cadet now studied alongside the great victories of hegemony history, not because it was a victory, but because it was the clearest lesson the hegemony had ever been forced to learn about the cost of certainty. It carried no official title beyond its catalog number, but the instructors who taught it, almost without exception, used the same phrase to introduce it, a phrase pulled directly from the bridge recordings of a ship called the Iron Verdict, spoken in a voice that had not known, in the moment it was recorded, just how completely it would come to define an entire era of hegemony military thinking. General, it is the humans, and they are not amused. It was not meant anymore as a joke. It had never really been one. It was simply the truest thing anyone aboard that ship had managed to say all day, and the hegemony, slowly and at considerable cost, had finally learned to listen.